Hello, and welcome to Looking Out, the podcast in which we connect the dots across mobility, design, and culture. My name is Joe Simpson, and I'm a strategist at an automotive OEM in Europe, whose views I do not and have never represented on this show.
And my name is Drew Smith, and I am a design strategist currently located somewhere in the countryside in Japan.
What are we going to talk about tonight, Drew?
Opinions.
We've got.
I think that's basically what it comes down to, Joe. It comes down to having an opinion. And you, as our regular listeners, will know that we have plenty of them. But I think where we land in this show is a very fervent desire for the industry to have a bit more of an opinion about where we are, where we're headed, and the role that we want them to play in that.
Absolutely. Should we crack on?
Can we start with Scout?
Yes, let's start with Scout. Can I go first?
Yes.
Sorry, that was very Yorkshire. So here's my sort of start of a 10 on Scout. Drew, how come is it that I feel like the Scout offering is actually perfectly rational, and if as a designer and strategist I look at it from afar and imagine myself in that company, I think it makes total sense, and that they've done quite a good job, and that the range extender makes sense, and I really like the fact they've got buttons, and I can see the reference to the old brand, and the price, if they can get it out of that, is actually very competitive. And yet the whole thing feels somehow less than the sum of its parts, and the whole thing, given the quite some sort of noise that they'd managed to drum up on social media, and the anticipation that had been created, somehow felt like an inevitable anticlimax. Or am I being really, really harsh?
I think there's a couple of things at play here. Aside from the absolutely enormous size of the things, I saw somebody did an overlay of the Scouts with the Hummer EV, and there's like a fag paper between them. Yeah. So let's just put that aside for a second, and the very obvious question of whether the world needs another absolutely ginormous
truck
EV SUV. How long ago did Volkswagen Group release those sketches?
I've got it been kicking around a couple of years.
I'm thinking like 2020, 2021?
I think 21 or 22 maybe, yeah. I don't know.
Okay, 21, 22, right? Which is a long time for sketches to have been kicking around, right? Those two side profile sketches of, I think it was like a pickup and a sort of a station wagon-ish looking SUV, right?
Yeah.
And in those 2 years, we've also had the Wank Panzer come along, the Cybertruck, and we've also had Rivian become the reasonable choice. Also because there's been the Hummer, right? Which the Hummer caused outrage, the Wank Panzer caused outrage, and there's Rivian owning this entirely reasonable American adventure, mid-century infused kind of premium luxury space.
Yeah, premium nostalgia, outdoor kind of nature-y, nice people in the Pacific Northwest image.
Yeah, like if the Lincoln of 1961 decided to make an off-roader, that's what the R1 is.
Yeah.
Right? And then they've come along and they've doubled down on that aesthetic and extended that aesthetic with a couple of very compelling concepts in the shape of the R2 and the R3.
Yeah.
Which shows that Rivian's theme, if you like, can be extended and evolved very successfully. Yeah, right. It scales quite effectively. And then Scout comes along and basically And I know Ryan McManus says that this is a very lazy reading of it, but it's very hard for me to escape that the feeling that Scout has come along and basically said, "Oh, we'll have some of that,"
Yeah,
and kind of come in with very much the same feeling, right? Because the product comes culturally,
from the same place.
aesthetically, from very much the same place. And I wonder if that's why it feels kind of anticlimactic and a little bit old, because like we've been looking at Rivians for a few years
Yeah,
now and people have been loving them, and like now we're being asked to look at something that thematically
is
does a
similar.
similar
And I
job.
think I feel like what you're saying, if I unpick what you're saying, is that this is a really interesting case of brand and product. I genuinely think the product in the case of Scout is fine and it's in many ways very commendable, but it doesn't really bring anything new. But then if you think about the entire brand sort of proposition,
Mm.
and I think this is interesting, then maybe later we'll get to talking about Renault. The idea of nostalgia and the idea of like, resurrecting brands, or the idea of resurrecting ideas which are sort of, 3 or 4 decades old, can it sort of stand? How many Scout fans are there out there, and how many of them today can and want to buy a $70,000 SUV? But so what I think we're saying, or what I'm saying, or how I feel about this, is that everybody I know, you and me particularly, but lots of people I've spoken to in my life, have walked into a Rivian store and basically said, Christ, I'd been in there about 20 minutes and I just wanted the product, because the entire brand position was just
Mm.
so, it was like, yeah, this makes 100% sense. Someone owned the idea of what America is in a totally good
Mm.
way. A really big country which has amazing nature. And if you travel across America, you can kind of understand why, whatever it is, percentage of Americans don't have passports, because the place is incredible. You like Utah's like the moon, and then you've got like sort of
Mm.
the parts of the Pacific
And you've got
Northwest and stuff, and
the Rivian Adventure Network.
and then you've got
Like,
Rivian Adventures, and they built that entire brand on the idea of like sort of finding that. And there's something
mm.
like 30 million Americans identify as like outdoor nature people who care for the environment. And Rivian gives you this sort of idea that you're part of that, and that the
Yeah.
products allow you to access that. And you do that by treading lightly and in many clever ways. And you can take them camping, and the car levels itself out, and there's all this tech that sort of augments it. And it does it in this really nice, warm feeling way, which makes you feel good about yourself and that you're not smashing and destroying the planet, despite the fact you're driving a sort of £7,000 SUV. And it's just really hits at the heart of, I think, what quite a lot of upper middle class Americans who are
Right.
probably a little left leaning, a little outdoorsy, a little liberal, like want and then can afford.
Hmm.
And they bought into that. And I don't really get what Scout, and I'm really quite happy to be corrected on this if someone wants to do a counter piece, but I really don't understand what Scout's bringing that Rivian has already, other than this sense of this historic community and Scout meaning something back in the day to sorry, but as far as I can see, a kind of handful of people. Um,
I mean, Tim Waltz is a Scout fan. I mean,
well, so maybe, maybe this time next week it'll be very different. Maybe he'll have stood up on stage and,
maybe that's what Wolfsburg's counting on, is Tim Waltz getting in.
But I think that's the other thing about Scout, is that it was, it has been set up so that, as I understand it, it's quite separate to Volkswagen. Yes, it has the backing of Volkswagen, but they made
Mm.
all the people like Scott Keogh actually like quit their jobs and then sort of have a new one, and it's going to be floated at some point in the future as an entity which is not sort of wholly and sort of a wholly subsidiary of the Volkswagen Group. So it sort of feels like it's trying to set itself up as like, well, we've got the security, and I mean, reading the news last week, I don't know about that, but the security of the Volkswagen
I'm not sure
Group,
that Volkswagen and security should be going in the same
sentence
sentence
right
at this
now.
point in time.
Yeah. quite, but the independence of a a startup. So I think it's fascinating.
How's that worked out for all the other startup EV brands, Joe?
Including Rivian, who, let's not forget, Elon likes to remind us, have what, 6 quarters of cash left, maybe a bit more now. Volkswagen put some money in, but it's still, it does feel, if we're being fair and due diligence, that will they actually get to the point that they can make the R2 and the R3? It's probably a coin toss.
I think there's something really interesting about coming back to what has been successful about Rivian is that the narrative that they've managed to tell has extended way beyond the car.
Yeah,
Right? There's a narrative depth to Rivian as a brand.
yeah,
And one always has to be careful when Germans set out to undertake some cultural appropriation.
careful now.
Hasn't always gone so well for them, because there can be a focus on superficiality, kind of surface level storytelling at the cost of a really deep understanding of what makes a brand great, or what has made a brand great. And I think it's interesting to look at what happened to Bentley pretty much straight away under Volkswagen Group. It's interesting to look at what has happened with Mini over time at BMW. And I wonder whether there is. I was listening to, again, Jason Kimmys and Derek Tamscott talking about Ferdinand Piech. It was the Piech-isode. And they were talking about how with Piech and Piech's Volkswagen, it was such a phenomenally sort of product-oriented organization. Like, everything was about the product. The product told the story. You didn't really need to do anything else because the product was so phenomenally good. Piech didn't care about shareholder value. He didn't care about the narrative being told to the market. That's ultimately why they contend that he lost in the fight to Winterkorn, because Winterkorn knew that he needed to tell a story to the shareholders. So I guess what I'm trying to get to here is, and I think it's interesting actually, if you look at Porsche's marketing communications these days, they are also struggling with the idea that there now needs to be a story beyond the product.
Yeah.
And they're not really able to tell it very effectively. What is the strapline for the facelifted Taycan? Overfeel?
Is it?
I think it's overfeel. And I'm seeing it on billboards all around Sydney, and I'm like, overfeel what? Like, so this very long and difficult thing that I'm trying to express is, we expect more from a brand. We expect the creation of a world. It's not enough any longer, I think, for the product to just kind of be out there and be its own thing, and we create the world around it.
Yeah.
We don't kind of live in that cultural space anymore. And I think that's what Rivian has done so unbelievably well. I think it's what Tesla did so unbelievably well.
Yeah.
Right? You bought into a way of thinking. You bought into a way of being that was served up to you on a plate.
Sorry, no, I wasn't.
No,
I was.
No.
I think this is fascinating, because here what we're talking about is brand, and for me, this is overly simplistic. However, I think brand at a fundamental level. If you're a legacy brand was the promise. What is it delivering and doing for you?
Yeah.
So, what's your promise to the customer? What are they buying into? And historically, I think with the legacy brands, that's been about something that was tangible and generally related to the product. In Mercedes-Benz, it was basically the highest quality luxury cars in the world.
The beste oder nichts.
The beste oder nichts. And what's been, I think, interesting about the new brands, the startup brands, and to your point about Tesla and then Rivian's narrative, is that the ones that are successful tell a narrative that is about the future, and it's kind of ownership of narrative. And Tesla has kind of created this narrative about all these things relate to, that world that Elon has kind of created, and the network, and the sort of the idea of the electric car, and then it's now the idea, or has been for a long time, the idea of the autonomous car and cars that could drive themselves, and then what that meant. Rivian has done that with these kind of fundamentally American values, and with this idea of this sort of, as you say, adventure and access to nature and the wilds. And that's a very, very compelling thing that people want and want to have. And that's the value of the brand. And I think Scouts, what I thought it was, based on what was being told to me before I saw the products, was about this sense of community. And it will be fascinating to see if Scout can actually then build that out, because it's going to be hard. But I want to do a pivot from this. I'm sure you want to come back, but I want to pivot on this, which is that then if you think about some of the other things that are happening in the car industry, isn't it fascinating when you talk about Piech and Piech being centered around what the product and the product did, that if I look at what's happening at Volkswagen...
Jesus. Okay, yes.
There's a pivot. And some of the other groups that are in trouble, notably Stellantis, I think, and maybe this is my view as a designer and a product person, that you can say a lot, and there'll be a lot of stuff, a lot of bad decisions, a lot of things that happen in the background, a lot of external circumstances. But fundamentally, one of the problems for Volkswagen right now, and they admit this, and it's being written about left, right, and centre, is that the product has not been good enough. And the product has not lived up to the promise of the brand. The people's car that was of a certain quality and reliability level that meant it was worth paying just a bit more for than a mainstream brand. When I was growing up, the Volkswagen Golf advert in the UK was, if only everything in life was as reliable as a Volkswagen. And, my dad had a Golf Mark II, and it was probably the most reliable car we ever had. And there was a sense of the quality, the sense of quality, even as a kind of 6-year-old, was palpable relative to the Opel Astra that we had, it's a Vauxhall Astra in the UK, that we had before that. And then I think where Volkswagen's at now, the pivot to electrification, the ID cars, the sense that they had to, for cost reasons, they sacrificed that at least perceived sense of quality. The value of the fit and finish, the materials, the perceived quality, the things that Piech held dear, and then the software that underpinned it, and the frankly, the shambles that was Cariad, meant that the quality
Freudian slip.
that meant that the quality of those products and what they were as vehicles and what they represented didn't live up to what Volkswagen stands for in people's minds as a brand. And it shows how quickly you can slip, because in one generation, if I think of things like the Golf 7 and the Passat, I think it was a Passat 8, those cars had a design quality to them which was actually really harked back to sort of the generation 1 and 2. They were very simple on the face of it, pieces of design, executed extremely well. The perceived quality, the materials, was a step above another mainstream brand like Opel. the interface and the way you interacted with them and the way they drove was solid and was
Yep.
somewhere between a mainstream and a premium brand. They felt of a high quality. So the idea of why someone would buy them was quite clear. If you've
Yes.
driven a Golf 8 or an ID3 or an ID4, and I'm at risk of really kind of stepping over the limits of what I should say working for another brand here, but they don't have that sense. And I think that to me is the fundamental of where things have gone wrong. Yes, there are structural issues. There are market issues. Of course. I don't think Volkswagen would be in where it's at now if the product was right.
But as my boss Ben Langdon always used to say when we were preparing pitches, answer the fucking exam question. And Volkswagen's fucking exam question is the Golf.
Yeah.
And I was talking with a guy called Justin Harness, who he runs a strategy consulting firm in Berlin. And we get on the phone every 6 months or so to talk about the state of the industry.
Yeah.
And he's kind of like a non-car guy, but does work with car companies. And, I'm clearly very doing no work with car companies. And it's an interesting combo. He was talking about the failure of ID as a brand. And again, the thing that came up for me was this idea of narrative dilution and how with the ID products, Volkswagen confused the consumer about what a Volkswagen is. And I think the very fact that they set up an entire separate brand for the electric products says something really interesting. It's like we're not confident enough to put a Golf badge on this.
Yeah.
We're not confident enough to put a Passat badge on
Yeah.
this or a Tiguan badge on this. And they were right to be unconfident about it. I remember when I was living in Frankfurt and there was where was I? No, it was I can't remember where I was living. Anyway, I was catching the train through Germany sort of semi-regularly. And I remember just seeing ID3s sat in fields
Yeah.
outside one of the plants for probably a good 8 months, and they just didn't move. And I think there was some story about, OTA not working, over-the-air updates not working, and all of these cars having to be reflashed by USB stick. Right? And I think there was product sort of being manufactured and sat fallow for a year before it was being shipped out to market. The ID did not answer the Volkswagen exam question.
No.
And I think if you look at the entire ID range from a design perspective, they look limp.
Yeah.
They look flaccid. They have sort of the design integrity of a pool noodle. And lo and behold, when you get inside of them, I think to your point, Volkswagen's challenges with bringing these cars to market with the confidence that they once had is you feel it everywhere.
And this is, to me, another then pivot where I wanted to go with the show. And I'm sorry to the listeners if these pivots seem a little bit tenuous and bizarre.
I love having you in the driving seat. It's like, whip me harder.
Oh, God. No. I think it's fascinating how confidence and like who's driving in the company really is told through products. And I believe customers can see this. And I want to compare and contrast where Volkswagen is, where, as you said, it's a lack of confidence in the core product, which has led to them setting up that sub brand, nervousness, some questionable decisions. I think, there, but for the grace of God, I could have been working in Volkswagen and fighting for illuminated buttons and physical buttons and losing those battles there. And, I'm sure there's people there who's like, oh, we knew this was going to happen. Bloody hell.
Can I just say that there's a guy, I think he's a fairly senior person in UX at Volkswagen Group, who posted on
I
Threads
saw this.
about his outrage that Apple has put the power button on the new Mac Mini on the underside of the Mac Mini. Bearing in mind that, like, if you're a Mac owner, you basically hardly ever power cycle
Don't turn it off.
like a Mac, right? You just never turn them off. An Apple app developer, a guy who develops a beautiful
They've
photography
lost their
app.
way. Yeah, he said they've lost their
Yeah, he's
way.
like, Apple's lost their way, and then this Apple software developer who produces a beautiful photography app called Halide popped up in his comments and said, "This coming from the guy that works for a company that thought it was okay to put non-illuminated touch strips to control climate.
Exactly.
and audio, like." Pot, kettle, and black are the words that are coming to mind. But that was just an aside.
No, but it sort of, it kind of sits as part of the kind of the wider narrative, which is, I think, these products, they lack an opinion. They don't have a point of view.
Yes.
Chris Bangle talked about how great products have like a character. They have personalities. They have like behavioral traits. They have meaning. They anthropomorphism. The ID products don't. They're just limp, flaccid
ball noodles.
Yeah. And I wanted to, whereas a company like, sorry to mention them again, Hyundai, I was looking at the Santa Fe earlier, the new Santa Fe. It's wild. It's a box on wheels. It's an outdoorsy box on wheels, and you can get it in like brown and stuff. And it's got steps you can get up onto the roof, and you can get beds to put in it. And it's like, yeah, in some ways, it's all the recent trends jammed into one car. But fuck me, it has an opinion about what it wants to be, and some people will hate it. And Hyundai probably went, yeah, we're absolutely fine with that because some people will love it, and it's this. And I think this is the thing. What I think Volkswagen and a lot of companies have been doing have been going, shit, we need to make a product that hits this cost and this numbers in Europe, and we need to be able to hit all the American regulations and make American customers want them too. And then in China, there's all this stuff going on over here, and it's kind of software developed vehicles. We need to appeal to the Chinese, and we've got to be cost raised to the bottom. And then you end up with this kind of generic blob of product which speaks to no one and has no opinion about what it is. And I think
you've nailed it. You've nailed it. And I think we have lost amongst many of the strongest brands. They've lost their opinionatedness, like that sense of having a particular point of view on the world that could only come from that brand.
Yeah.
And that's where I think Scout comes unstuck, because its point of view feels too much like Rivian's. Volkswagen doesn't have a point of view. I see brands that historically have had very strong points of view, as you say, basically whittling away the sort of the physical, tactile, sensorial manifestations of those points of view, simply out of sort of expediency, just trying to get product to market as quickly as possible and to make it as broadly appealing as possible. And, start appealing to everybody and you'll appeal to no one.
Right. And this is, I think, we've got to take into account here things like the impact of COVID, when no one could go out and actually really understand what was going on in the world, or kind of get face to face with customers. Because I think in all these companies, and as again, there's a total there, but for the way it's got to go, I think there will be designers and there will be product people who push for and want a strong opinion. But when you've got very complex market factors, when you've got like real kind of cost bloodbaths, when you've got markets that are diverging, but you're trying to make products that kind of work in all spaces. And when you're a brand like as big as someone like Volkswagen, it's very easy just to sort of end up, as the Swedes would say, as mellanmjölk, which is basically, sort of the semi-skimmed,
I think you were going to say it sounds like off milk.
Melon means middle, so it's like it's just this kind of
middle
like
milk,
mid the kind of the sort of
blancmange
middle ground. Yeah,
we might say. So how does Renault come into all of that?
So yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I think that what I see Renault doing, or what I saw Renault doing in Paris, and I really want to get your take on this from afar, is having, and it depends, it's interesting the way you talk about the Renault group, or if you talk about Renault, let's talk about Renault as a brand, that you have a really, I would say, schizophrenic brand now, a portfolio of cars that I don't understand, but which contains, or will soon contain, a series of products where what they've leaned into is their history and tried then to create cars which do make a strong statement and have a strong opinion in the world. So we're talking here about the Renault 5, and then the at Paris launched Renault 4, and then shortly to come also the new Twingo, which we've seen in concept form, that green thing you might imagine, which I'm reliably informed is 85% production.
Right.
So with my product planner's hat on, there's a kind of thing where I'm scratching my head going, hang on though, you've got all these products which kind of sit almost on top of each other, both in terms of footprint and sort of specs and price. And I'm not really sure, therefore, sort of how this is going to play out and work, given they're all sort of Europe only. And where I think people, what Renault want people to do is kind of buy into a sort of a heritage and sort of icon based idea. And I think with the Renault 5, it works exceptionally well. I think that product is brilliantly executed. The reviews which are just coming out now say it's great to drive and a kind of great offer. It's well priced. I don't really understand how they're making any money on it at that price. It's got lots of content. Things like the seats are wonderful. It's got kind of quite a lot of physical interface. It has this kind of really quite sort of charming, but ultimately just fairly fun and playful character, which is really refreshing given everything else that's going on in the world and the rest of the car industry. And I can see them selling like hotcakes, and I've even thought I would happily have one myself. But then, and I think that's because it sort of seems to do a good job to me of referencing and relating to what the Renault 5 represented. First sort of super mini in Europe, very kind of a sort of set a die for kind of small cars, which still exists for this day. So it's not radical, but it kind of references that in a way which makes sense for kind of modern day times, in that sort of it's affordable, it has enough space, but it also has this sort of gloriously sort of chic Frenchness to it, which gives it quite a lot of character. But then when you get to the 4, which really was Renault's 2CV or Beetle, it feels like things have gone a little bit awry, because broadly what's happened is we've taken the 5 and sort of jacked it up a bit and turned it into kind of COD crossover. And the only thing that really sort of references the 4 is the fact that the tailgate is kind of you know,
Oh,
leaning and goes quite deep. So it kind of
yeah,
like pulls away quite a lot of the bumper. So the load floor is super, super low. And there are some clever things in it, like it's quite practical, like the passenger seat folds forward and they're showing it with surfboards and stuff in it. But other than that, it really it verges into this kind of like pastiche styling exercise, and it does a great disservice to what the four was, which was very much
mm,
this kind of car which I think, along with the 2CV, helped mobilize France and was very kind of like was very radical in terms of its layout, was kind of very spacious, was very sort of unique in terms of the sort of the aesthetic that the kind of
mm.
the kind of setup drove. And I had a conversation with a couple of people at the Paris show about this, and there was a sense that it's a real missed opportunity by Renault, like that this was the that the five should have been kind of like the fun, playful, sort of mini leaning one, but the four
Yep,
could have really been the car for the people that really was, electric mobility for the people. They could have really stolen a march on Volkswagen here. Instead, they're selling
yep.
it as a €4,000 more than the five crossover-y thing, which I don't know. It just doesn't quite make sense to me as a product and an offering. But what did you think from afar?
Well, I mean, apart from the fact that the four looks like a bad Mitsuoka Japanese graph job, and that's saying something because the Mitsuokas are typically not particularly handsome cars. Um, I, as you've been talking, and I think about these three products, um, what made them iconic? Yes, it was the way they looked, but in a very or to a very significant extent, the way they looked was determined by
Yeah,
a radical functionality,
right.
like a radical repositioning of what the car could be.
Yeah,
I'd like to think that's true for both the original four,
and the five
the original five,
and the
and
Twingo.
the Twingo,
Yeah,
right? And these three cars are not that.
no,
They are they are kind of like Volkswagen New Beetle Redux in a way. Um, they're not the reimagining that the original was. They are a re-expression of a design theme or
yeah,
a style theme in a way. And my concern is that within about 12 months, Volkswagen New Beetle felt like stale milk.
yeah, yeah,
And then they went on and produced a second generation,
yeah.
by which stage the concept had completely curdled.
Mm.
Um, what kind of legs does the new 4, 5, and Twingo have to take Renault into the future? And if we look at, if we look at the trend of products being around for longer, simply because the cost of developing them is so much greater at this point in time, and I don't know, maybe that gets better with time. They can churn things out faster. But if these cars are going to be around for a long time, and this was my problem with the five, right? Is it feels extremely of the moment, and I have absolutely no doubt that it will sell very well.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a brittleness to it that I wonder whether it will age particularly well. And if these cars had been less about pure styling throwbacks and more recapturing sort of the conceptual essence of what these products did in the God, when did the four originally come out? 60s,
Yeah.
70s,
And
and
then late
early
80s.
90s,
Yeah.
late 80s, early 90s, right? and you think about what these cars did for the car as opposed to what these cars did stylistically, you might have wound up in a more interesting
I
place.
absolutely agree. And I mean, I think I'm struggling to describe why it is. I know there are many people who share your opinion about the five. I think the five gets away with it. There's a, there is a, there's a sort of lightness of hand and a sort of sense of someone having had fun and not having had too much of a sort of constrained
Sure.
marketing, product planning brief. You know, it was supposedly done in design. Luke de Meyer came along, saw it in a corner, was like, "What's that?" And then was like, "Okay, we have to build that." And it speaks a bit of that. And I hear you, but I don't think it's quite as pastiche as the new Beetle was. And I think it will. I see it more as like a equivalent to the 500, where I feel like it's the kind of car that's been designed in such a way where if you keep cycling CMF and every couple of years you bring in new colors, some new materials, some new trims, the 3D printed parts, new wheels,
Yep.
you can keep it feeling fairly fresh, and so it doesn't
Yep.
kind of date that badly that quickly. But I'm
Mm.
totally with you on the four and the Twingo. And I think the fundamental point you make is absolutely right. We as designers need to stop obsessing about icons for the sake of them being icons and go back to understanding what made that car an icon in the first place. And as you said, with something like the four, it came from the radical nature of its setup and what it was designed to do. And if you go and sort of rethink that for modern days, I think you'd have wound up in a very different place to where they have with the current one, which feels like very much okay, we've done this with the five and we've got this kind of, sort of technology toolbox. How many products can we spin off it and, make the numbers stack up, because we're going to be asking the supplier for X million parts a year rather than half a
Yeah.
million parts a year.
I,
Um,
I want to play devil's advocate with my own point of view here, which is, remember when BMW got Rover Group,
yeah,
and there were essentially two competing proposals for Mini.
yeah,
There were the spirituals,
yeah.
and then there was the Frank Stephenson
Yeah,
R50 to
R50.
53
Oh,
R50
yeah, the first one.
that
Yeah,
we all know and love,
yeah,
right? And I have no doubt that at that point in time, BMW made absolutely the right choice.
yeah.
And yet, I guess the optimist in me wishes that something had become the spirituals, and I guess it's a similar sort of thing with the Renault product for me. It's like, what if you brought that same level of and I guess this is why I'm making this point, because I think we are sort of at the point now in terms of where we are with challenges around mobility and transit equity and climate crisis and all of the other clusterfucks that we are kind of currently
I think.
facing into. Like, surely there's the opportunity to do something that is
You.
not just yeah,
Well, this
like, to do
this is what we're.
something
This is what's
new.
so weird. This is what's so weird, and I think I sent you on text. And what I want to say, I feel my issue with all of this, and where the French brands are, and we talk about. I don't want to talk about that SM concept. I just don't want to talk about it because it makes me sad. But I grew
I
up. You
felt
grew up.
ill when I saw
Yeah,
that.
it's like, but we all grew up. Probably, I'd say we all. Let's generalize. People in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I think we grew up with the French brands as actually what the French brands really represented to me was this really. They were progressive. They had an idea. Again, they had an opinion. They had a view about what the future was. The
Mm.
DS, the SM, even the concepts I grew up covering from the French brands in the 2000s, the late 2000s, all the Le Command concepts,
Yep.
the Scenic, the Espace. All right, we're talking 80s,
Velsatis.
90s, Velsatis, Aventime.
Concept, not production.
Yes, some of them, when they went into production, commercial flops. And the same with Citroen. And it's like they were really strong statements about the future, and they did radical things and they did things differently, and that was a reason to choose them. Or they did things better. Citroen, I think, did things radically differently, and sometimes they were radically better. Renault, with things like the Espace and the Scenic, rethought how a family would be together on the move to make things radically better. And it was interesting talking to Anna Sensio. I talked to her about the Four, and we were comparing it to the Scenic and how the Scenic had come about. And it was really interesting to get her views on it. And I'm curious why then that a brand like Renault is leaning so heavily into its heritage, when even with things like the R17, which I think whether you like it or not, it's this really obscure thing. And I'd much sooner see, me personally, I'd much sooner see them showing me some kind of future vision of what mobility is like. And I think, to me, when you combine that with what we said about Volkswagen, it's weird. It's like Europe and the European brands, which were once the progressive brands that used technology or used their sort of social capital in Europe to move forward and present progressive ideas, now appear to be stuck in this crisis of confidence where they're just looking backwards. And it's left to the Chinese brands or the American brands to show us what a progressive idea looks like. And that, to me, as a European, is a bit odd and a bit sad. And I really hope that somebody can show us something that gives hope.
Isn't that your job? I mean, by the by,
that's it for tonight's Looking Out podcast, folks.
Sorry, that could have been a mic drop moment, but I couldn't help myself. You know who's making the new Renault Scenic? Zeekr Mix.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Very true. And I hand it to some friends and acquaintances across the other side of town who really have smashed out the park with that. It's very true.
That as soon as I saw it, as I saw that car, I'm like, oh, that's the family EV, like conceptually at least, that Renault could have been making.
Yeah. And I put it to you, Drew, that no brand based in Europe,
would have the guts to do that.
None of their product teams or their management teams would have had the guts to put that on the market, because I know, I look at the data and what it tells you is that there's not a market there for that product.
No. And, I mean, look, the proof will absolutely be in the pudding, but yeah, this is where I kind of am feeling myself tear away from the industry. You know, it was an industry that once upon a time sold us visions of the future that in some ways, I don't want to say in every way, but in some ways made lives better, qualitatively and quantitatively better, and also did so in a way that excited us and engaged us and led us to feel that progress was kind of, it was sort of an inevitability. And whether you're Volkswagen producing an electric pool noodle, or your Renault kind of raiding your back catalogue, or your Mercedes doing, I don't even know what the hell Mercedes is doing anymore, like that sense of, the future will be a better place, the future will be a more intelligent place, the future will be a more humane place, that ground has now, it feels like it's just been thoroughly seeded by the Europeans.
But to the point where we've just commoditized the car. And I was in the UK last week, and I had a new, I don't know what the nomenclature is, I'm terrible with Mercedes, but I had a new Mercedes C-Class estate, which was a nice upgrade to get from like Sixt, and was very handy when I've got a child who's currently got a broken leg, so there was space for my wife to sit in the back, so you need to sit in the front. But when I was reflecting on it and thinking, well, this is quite a nice thing. And, if I didn't like work for the brand I do, maybe I could consider having one of these as a family car. But I was a bit like, at the same time, just like, because I was like, when you compare it to the S204 that I had, which is like a 2 generations hence C-Class estate, I was like, is it a bit quieter? Yeah. Would it be a bit safer? Yeah. Is it slightly more comfortable? Maybe. Was it?
Yeah, but your old one's seat control panels didn't
Well,
creak
I was
when
going to
you
say,
pressed on them.
was it harder to use the new one? Yes.
A lot.
Did it feel as high quality and well built? No. Was there any more space? No. Was it notably, I don't know, progress? Define progress. It's like, no, it hadn't really moved the game on. It's just I buy a new car every 3 years and that's sort of what happens. But it's not, there was no sense of breakthrough or no sense of wow that I think would compel you to be like, if you were landing from Mars or never had a car or weren't in the habit of having a new company car every 3 years, it would be like, yes, this is the answer to all my problems and mobility solutions. It's just like, we're not really going anywhere. And I think that's a problem. But I don't know what the answer is. Sorry, this is terrible.
No, I mean, I'm trying to find a way to kind of bring all of this together, and I think I keep coming back to this idea of opinion. What is the opinion that you want to have on the world? Having a point of view. Now, I mean, you can agree whether this is right or wrong at a philosophical level, right? But it seems to me that we very much live in an age where having a point of view and taking a stand and being able to create a narrative around how you think the world should be is kind of a prerequisite
Right.
for brand and therefore product to achieve any kind of cut through.
Yeah.
And good fucking luck if you can't do that, if you can't seize and shape a narrative for yourself. Because in a world in which product is, just by virtue of sort of electrification and optimization, is all kind of converging on a functional point, the thing that's going to make you stand out is the world that you can create for the consumer, somebody who might be interested in buying into that.
100%.
I think that's kind of where we've landed.
I think so. I really think so. Have an opinion. We do.
Yeah, have an opinion. We've got lots of them, many of them wrong. Look, I'm not going to give myself shit for that. This did happen at 5:30 in the morning in a different time zone for me. You have been listening to Looking Out the podcast. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. It has been a pleasure to bring you these last 2 shows, which is nice for me. If you like this show, please consider giving it a rating on your favorite podcast app, or if you're watching this on YouTube, share it with somebody who might like it. Looking At the podcast was presented by me, Drew Smith.
And me, Joe Simpson.
This is Drew Smith. Thank you so much for listening and watching.
Was I too ranty?
I haven't seen you this ranty in a while.